Well, the month of June is winding down, and as we were talking about earlier, that means Pride Month's over, and it was not so much as what the LGBT community was hoping for without the government and corporate America forcing it down the throats of Americans. But there's something else. As June is winding down, that means most of the decisions from this term of the U.S. Supreme Court are being released. And usually goes into the first part of July. Well, earlier today, the court handed down a pretty significant ruling, a 6-3 decision in Medina versus Planned Parenthood, South Atlantic. The court's decision allows states like South Carolina to redirect taxpayer dollars, in this case, Medicaid dollars, away from abortion facilities like Planned Parenthood. So what does this ruling mean? What does this ruling mean for states all across the nation? Well, here to discuss this is Suzanne Bowdey, editorial director and senior writer at the Washington Stand, and Travis Weber, vice president for policy and government affairs here at the Family Research Council. Travis, Suzanne, thanks for joining me today.
Thanks, Tony.
So, Travis, let me start with you. You're an attorney. So what are the implications of today's decision by the Supreme Court regarding South Carolina and Planned Parenthood?
Yeah, so Tony, as you noted, this will give states the freedom to determine, how the dollars flowing through their state are spent with regard to whether they want to side on the side of death or the side of life. This question of abortion and the most well-known abortion mill, Planned Parenthood. And so it's really a matter of state policies and state governments, as the people voice their support for life in those states, being able to say, we want these funds to go to not go to Planned Parenthood or any other similar abortion providers, with regard to the interpretation of federal statute here that the Supreme Court is dealing with. So I think this is a win, certainly for the rule of law. It's a win for the voice of the people in the states, and it gives light and life to the. This allows the people to voice their support for life in the states and allows the states to be a laboratory for democracy, as our country should provide for, and allow them to continue to support life. So I think we're very encouraged by this in terms of the pro-life policy outcome, Tony, but also for the people in the states to say, we want our state to protect life as well.
Suzanne, Planned Parenthood, in their most recent annual report, shows that they performed over 400,000 abortions, a record for them in terms of the number of abortions, and they received nearly $800 million from taxpayers. That's really just kind of they put forward this idea that they are a healthcare provider, breast examinations, contraceptive counsel and consultation. They're really an abortion provider. That's all they do, and that is not health care.
I would say they're not a provider. I would say they're a business, and a multi-million-dollar business. Those procedures that you talked about, abortion, and now that they've branched out into gender transition procedures, are cash cows for them. They make millions of dollars off of these things, and they do not need the government's money, taxpayers' money in the states or federally financing them. They're doing pretty well on their own, and it's not, as you point out rightly, they're not providing the services that they claim to in abundance, which is,
Right.
STD testing, adoption referrals, other things.
And that's what they were basing their claim, that they should be treated like any other provider. Well, every other provider doesn't perform 400,000 abortions, and they're an abortion business. They are not a healthcare provider. But this, Suzanne, this also ties into what's happening on Capitol Hill right now with reconciliation.
It does, Tony. It's been really interesting to watch this process. I think a lot of Americans are probably confused about what's going on the Hill right now. They see the headlines about a Byrd Bath. What is that? They see the headlines about a Senate parliamentarian. And right now what's happening is that the Senate is combing through the bill that's just come out of the Senate Finance Committee, which is sort of a hodgepodge of both the House and Senate bills. And they're looking at various items and seeing if they qualify under the process of reconciliation. So under reconciliation, it's just a simple majority that you need to pass this bill, but the items have to be related to budgetary things or tax issues. And one of the big provisions in that bill that FRC has been very instrumental in lobbying for is to defund big abortion. And right now, as the Senate's looking at that provision has been preserved, largely because people are weighing in and saying they want their senators to defund abortion. As we've just seen, the federal government also needs to do that. It's not just states, but the federal government also needs to defund big abortion. There's a role for the federal government as well.
So Suzanne, just a little context, a little history on the Byrd Bath. People are thinking, what is this, some kind of like concrete pedestal up there with the birds fluttering around? That is named after Robert Byrd, the late Robert Byrd, who was a longtime member of the Senate and the finance overseeing that the appropriations. Explain what that is. It is a process by determining whether or not something fits within very narrow parameters of the 1973 Budget Reconciliation Act.
Right. So it's BYRD, not BIRD, for Robert Byrd, as you said. And the Senate is governed by very complicated procedures and rules. And as I mentioned, reconciliation is one of those very complicated processes. And so Robert Byrd was very concerned that if people wanted to pass something with a simple majority through the reconciliation process, they might take advantage of that and try to pass things that aren't related to the budget or taxes. So what he said was, okay, we need a rule in place where everything has to be looked at in terms of the budget and taxes. For instance, you can't have some pet project of a Democrat or a Republican hitching a ride on this bill to be passed just because it's a simple majority. So the Senate parliamentarian sits down, combs through the bill, sees which elements of that bill are budgetary and tax in nature. So that's called a Byrd Bath. Now, if she strikes something, right now that Senate parliamentarian is Elizabeth McDonough. She's been in the job for about 12 years. If she strikes something, it's called a Byrd dropping, hilariously. And the senators have to go back to the drawing board to see if they can tweak that language or if there's something they can do to make it qualify. But it's very important because you don't want people to take advantage of the process just to pass something with a simple majority. So right now, that's what's happening in the Senate, and we'll see what comes out of it. We've already seen a number of provisions stripped. One of them that we're keeping an eye on is gender transition funding for minors, which came out of the House unscathed, but may or may not be a casualty of the Senate side. I know we'll be working to convince people that, yes, this is a very important part of the budget and one that we want to see upheld as a ban and protect minors from those procedures.
So, Suzanne, does Big Bird factor in here anywhere?
I don't know, but it might ruffle some feathers.
Very good. Travis, Suzanne mentioned one of these other provisions that's in the bill, and that is the gender transition procedures that are being funded by taxpayers through various means, one, Medicaid. That was taken out of the House, that funding. It's kind of caught up in the Byrd Bath. We don't know what's going to happen. Might have to change the water there. But this is relevant this week. Actually, today is the 10th anniversary of the Obergefell decision. I was just talking with Dr. Ben Carson about this a few moments ago, that people don't realize that the court, when they redefined this institution of marriage, which God created and history has recognized through the millennia, that has opened a cultural Pandora's box that I think the American people are beginning to see.
Oh, Tony, absolutely, right? Because if you look just in recent 10, 15 years, right, so we can see a massive shift in terms of the public's awareness of the implications of going down this road of approval, public approval of really, I would say attacks or degradation of God's design of the family, of marriage, of us being created in his image, right? Because we're marking the 10-year anniversary of that unconstitutional decision, reading a desired policy outcome into the law in the Obergefell case, because our leaders and those sometimes, unfortunately, those in the judiciary do not have the moral clarity, objectivity, or a spine to stand up for what is right and under the rule of law as opposed to their desired outcome. So the implications, the casualties of that are really the American people, but the public. And so now people think it's okay because the court said it, right? But Tony, as you're noting, the transgender issue emerging in recent years, popping its head above ground, people seeing the ugly reality of what that is doing to our families, to parental rights, to parental authority, to children, to the teaching of children, all of the issues we've seen in the last 2 or 3 years, people are rightly reacting to that. But what the connection that you're noting that they need to make is the connection between that and what the court did in Obergefell, and any approval of the idea that somehow marriage can be between two people of the same biological sex. That's just not true. And so this is a very important picture, understanding, arc of truth, we could call it, right? To use, sometimes our opponents refer to the arc of history, but God is the author of truth and reality, and this is something we must call attention to and help people see when, unfortunately, our country has missed it in something like this.
Well, and to make these things fit, you have to force them. You have to use the force of government to make people accept it, and that's what we've seen over the last 10 years, especially under the previous administration, that targeted any dissent. Now, Suzanne, under this administration that has brought common sense back into the process, protecting religious freedom, there's a freer, even before this administration, I mean, there were Americans that said, look, truth is truth. I'm not going to abandon it. We just finished Pride Month. I was talking about this earlier in the program. Corporate America, even, I'm not sure that their heart is in it, but they are dialing it back because they see where the American public is. This is so important that we speak up, because as we speak up and as we take a stand, as I like to say, courage breeds courage, and we'll see more Americans standing against these lies, this deception, which is destructive and dangerous.
And I think one thing that's important to remember is this was 6 justices' opinions. Until 2022, I mean, this was not done legislatively. So we were substituting the country's opinion for 6 justices who believed that you could redefine what marriage is. And I think that the public never really went along with that idea. In fact, in 2022, when this was debated in Congress, people were really frustrated by the fact that we would continue down this path after we saw almost immediately the effect of Obergefell. Justice Kennedy, when he wrote that opinion, said he thought there were good people on both sides of the debate, and he cautioned people to take religious freedom seriously and protect it. And almost immediately, what did we see? We saw the religious freedom of bakers and florists, of county clerks. It opened up the door to attacks on education, conscience rights. So yes, I mean, the American people have seen the effects and they're horrified by it. So I think that's why, as you were talking about with Dr. Carson, the Republicans in particular have really pulled back on this idea that it's a good idea for the country. The support has dropped precipitously, about 14% on the GOP side. So I think we're going to continue to see people reevaluate this as a policy idea. Well,
in order to get to these cultural symptoms, you have to go back to the source. And I know that this will drive the left crazy. In fact, there was an article out today from Axios speaking about this, because I think the left is fearful, because the American people, now that they feel free to speak out, are saying, hey, this is not right. I don't want my kids indoctrinated. I don't want to have to share a bathroom with someone of the opposite sex. And so people are starting to push back. And I found it interesting that Axios, in making their argument for same-sex marriage, is very similar to what we've seen in the past, making an economic argument. I mean, this is nearly 600,000 same-sex couples in the U.S. have married since the Obergefell decision, boosting state and local economies by roughly $6 billion and generating an estimate $432 million in state sales tax revenue. This is where the world is. It measures everything by dollars, but not by right and wrong.
And Tony, I would even say, just hearing that headline, I would disagree with it. They're not married. They're claiming to be married. The civil government has given them a piece of paper that says they're married, but calling something doesn't make it so. They're in denial of reality. The author of creation, the Lord God himself, has determined what marriage is, and they're in violation of that. Therefore, they're not married. They're not in line with the truth. They can run around thinking that's not a marriage. And we have to correct the language of our country when it's going off the rails. And in this case, it is, just like we see on the transgender issue.
We have to uphold truth. Suzanne Bowdey, Travis Weber, thanks so much for joining me today.
Thank you.
Thanks, Tony.